After you're done with creating all the mechanisms for your rig, the next thing is to actually create the custom bone shapes. Custom bone shapes will help keep things usable, clean, and much faster for the animator to use. And when you combine this with bone colors and group them together in collections, it can really make things look neat and tidy. Now here's some thoughts I have when I create some custom bone shapes. They shouldn't get in the way of the character because the animator needs to see what's going on the screen without it being obscured. And it should be somewhat logical to the task it performs. However, if a shape would become ugly or distracting, it's best to choose a clean and simple shape over something that's more complicated than it needs to be, because animators will figure out what the control actually does. So in my view, you should aim to keep it as simple and clean as possible without overcomplicating the shapes. For example, in this foot roll control here, this is a semicircle type shape, which would suggest that it would only rotate in one direction. It can, however, rotate on all the other axes as well. I have intentionally gone for this nice, clean, simple design over adding a more complicated and ugly widget, which actually shows that you can rotate it on 3 axes. Animators are not idiots. They can see which channels are locked and what's not, and they will figure out what the control does by grabbing it and moving it. They don't need an ugly widget to tell them what they can do. What is a custom bone shape? A custom bone shape is just another object that we use to display in place of the bone. You can actually use a lot of different objects in Blender to create a custom shape. You can use most of the ones that actually contain geometry and a few that don't actually. However, most people will just use mesh objects, and that's what I would recommend as well. Now, we've spoken about naming conventions earlier, but this is just a name that we give to our objects so that we can recognize what it is. It's super common to use a prefix to name your objects that you're going to use as one of these shapes. And here are just some of the ones that I've seen. Some are short for widget, others for custom shape or bone shape, or even gizmo. I'm sure there's others too, but these are the ones that I've seen. I actually prefer the widget spelt WDGT because it looks more like the abbreviation of the word widget. However, just using WGT is more common. So that's what I use these days as well, even though it kind of looks like an abbreviation of the word widget. But hey, you can call your widgets whatever you like. Okay, so how do we actually apply a shape to any particular bone that we want? But I need to explain first what's going on here. We've got a simple armature, which is 3 bones, and I just have them aligned a little bit differently. We've got 2 bones that are aligned to the world. That means that these axes, the Y axis of the bone is following the world axis, the X axis is following the X axis of the world, and the Z axis is pointing up. And both of these bones are 1 Blender unit long, as you can see here. But there is a little bit of difference with bone 3 here, and that is that it is in its default orientation. So when you add a bone, this is the orientation that you'll get. So the Y-axis is pointing up, the Z-axis is pointing forward, and the X-axis is pointing to the right. But this one's actually 2 Blender units tall, which is also a difference from the other one. Now you might also notice that I have just placed the axes of the bone at the tail. This is not something that I recommend, but it's something that's going to help us visualize what's going on in this demonstration. And over here I have 3 mesh objects, and they're going to represent our shapes. We have a arrow Y small. This is 1 unit long, but the mesh flows along the world Y space. And then we have a arrow Y large, and this is the same as this one, except it goes for 2 Blender units in the Y direction. So how do we add one of these shapes to the bone? That's simple. We jump over into pose mode. We select whatever bone that we want to add a shape to, and then over in our bone tab, under viewport display, we have this custom shape here. I'll just bring this up, make it a little bit bigger. We can click in here and choose it. Let's just choose the Y small, and you can clear it with that button here. You can also use the eyedropper. So you can eyedrop here inside the viewport or up here in the outliner. So I'm going to choose Y small there. Now we can actually apply the same shape to multiple bones at once just by shift clicking them. We can't actually use the eyedropper for that. We have to actually hold down Alt when we click in here and then choose the shape that we want whilst holding Alt, and then voila. And for our final one here, I'm going to apply this arrow Z shape, which is going to point in the wrong direction, but I'll fix that in just a moment. Next, I want to explain some of these settings down here. This is a way that we can transform that shape without actually adjusting the original shape. So we can scale it on the X, the Y, or the Z if we like, although there is no Z depth, so it can't scale in that direction. We can do the same for the translation. We can reposition it if we want, or rotate it if we like as well. So these work all without adjusting that original shape. Okay, so before I fix this shape here, I want to explain why it's pointing in the wrong direction. When we add a shape, the origin of our object is going to be at the head of our bone, which is over here. And if you look at the axis the arrow is pointing on our bone, it's flowing along the positive z-axis. That is the direction that the geometry is flowing on our mesh object, the positive z. So it's mapping the world z of the shape to the local z of the bone. And that axis mismatch is our issue here. So there's a few things that we can do to fix it. We can orient our geometry in the correct axis. So I'm going to rotate around the 3D cursor because it's already in the right spot. So I'll go RX and then I want to go in -90. That is one way to fix it. I'll just undo that. Another way to fix it would be to actually change the way that it's rotating here. This is probably an easier way of doing it because we don't need to edit the original shape. So there we go, change that rotation to be -90 and it's matching again. Next up is to explain the scale to bone length. If I uncheck this, you'll notice that our shape doesn't go all the way to the tail. It only goes up one blender unit. So with this enabled, it's going to scale that whole entire shape to match the length of the bone. And that's super handy. And down here we have the wire width. This is a new setting in Blender 4.2, but we can change the thickness that that wireframe is going to display. And this is really handy because we can make certain controls thicker to make them seem more important, or some of them just are very difficult to see. You can just fatten them up a little bit and that will make everything much easier to see. So what does that wireframe option do? I'm going to select a shape here on this example that actually has some faces. And you can also see those faces on our bone. If I wanted to hide the faces, however, and just show the wireframe, I can click this. So this option is going to ignore any of the face data and just show the wireframe. This override transform option here will let you display the position of a bone actually at a different location. So I have bone 3 selected. I'm going to make it display at bone 1's location. Click. You notice when I move this around, you'll see the name move and it actually is rotating and scaling. However, it's just going to copy the transforms of bone 1 over here. But it's important to remember that this is just kind of like an optical illusion. The bone is actually over here. And I will just disable the shapes for now. You can see here is where our bone is, but it is displaying over here. Now you might be thinking that this is kind of crazy. Why would anyone want to do this? But trust me, this is super helpful in many situations. Here's a quick example that will show you when we might want to do something like this. This is a camera rig that ships with Blender. When I move the camera bone, you'll notice that the camera is targeting the target, but also when I move the target or our aim bone, it's pointing towards the camera. So how do you achieve this without running into a dependency cycle? The secret is in this override transforms option. There's a little mechanism layer here, and if I click on this bone, you'll see that we have a mechanism bone. That is the aim shape rotation. It has a copy rotation constraint, so it's just grabbing that rotation from our control here. So it's using a constraint to grab that rotation transformation. And then when we check out our aim bone here, you'll see under our viewport display, we're using that mechanism bone as an override. So wherever we move our camera, this is going to point to it and override the visual representation of our aim bone. If I disable this and then move it around, you'll notice it's not moving at all. It's just an optical illusion. So this little override trick is something that we do quite often to avoid a dependency cycle in a situation similar to this. Okay, so that's pretty much it for custom bone shapes. But you're probably thinking, geez, it's pretty difficult and a lot of work to create these custom bone shapes. And you'd be correct. So that's why I use the Bone Widget add-on to help automate all of this. Now, I'll include a link in the description. The add-on was originally created by Christophe Sue for Blender 2.7. However, I've been doing my own development of this since about 2019. And adding some handy features that I wanted to see in the tool. And recently, a CG Cookie member by the name of Marcus Berg has also been on a development blitz and has added a bunch more helpful features, including the image panel to select the appropriate widget that you've just seen. This add-on is free and open source, and it's designed to speed things up by keeping things organized, align all the shapes to match the bones, and it has a bunch of other time-saving tools, like the ability to mirror one shape across to the other side. But having said all this, it's important to note that CG Cookie does not provide technical support for this add-on. This is something that myself and Marcus have been developing in our spare time, and we've made it freely available to all. If you happen to find any bugs or you have any ideas on how to improve it, please let us know over at the GitHub page. But let me say this one more time. CG Cookie does not provide technical support for this add-on, but this tool saves us a bunch of time, so maybe it can save you a bunch of time too.